Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching with TBA Rabbinic Intern Rachel Cohn.
We have the fun, good fortune this week of starting a new book, like Rabbi Schatz beautifully started for us with her chanting, in the secular new year. So I thought that was a nice convergence of just our timelines this year. So I decided to focus on the transition from the end of Bereshit into the beginning of Shemot to help us reflect unto itself on like what that transition looks like in the Torah, and then see if that has anything to offer us in thinking about the narrative that we might tell ourselves or put out into the world about what it's like to start a new chapter of our life in the new year in 2021. So if you have the source sheet, great. If not, some of the sections are very easy to refer to in a Tanakh or Eitz Chaim. So we're going to start by reading just the first about 6 psukim in English, which we heard from Rabbi Schatz already, but just kind of a review that the beginning of Exodus, the name of the book in Hebrew is Shemot, because it begins by listing literally the names of the people who were the sons of Jacob or Israel who came into Egypt. So verses, this is either source 1 on the sheet, or just if you have a Tanakh, Exodus 1 chapters, verses 1 to 6. Sorry. So these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Judah, Yisachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. And then it gives, after listing the names, the total number of people who were in their households, basically. The total number that were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died and all his brothers in that generation. So if you started reading this book having never read anything else in the Torah, that might be helpful background. But the reality is, if you are somebody who's been following along the entire time, it might strike you that this is actually not new information. So if we were to go back to Genesis, what's listed as source number 2 on the sheet, Genesis chapter 46, starting at verse 8, we see something pretty similar with just kind of slightly more detail about who their sons were, that it basically says these are the names of all the people who were in Egypt that were descendants of Jacob or Israel. These are the names of the Israelites, Jacob and his descendants who came to Egypt. Jacob's firstborn, Reuven, and then it lists Reuven's sons, Shimon's sons, and then it goes on to list each of Jacob's sons and their sons. So you kind of get like a slightly more detailed sense, like mini census of who all the people were, the Israelites that ended up in Egypt. And we know Joseph was there because we've been reading the whole Joseph story and all that jazz. And then even the statement at the beginning of Exodus that Joseph had died, a good chunk of the last couple chapters of Genesis is going through the whole thing about what's happening as Joseph is dying and telling his brothers, I'm about to die. Please take my bones with you, this, that, and the other. And just kind of as a quick summary of all of that, what's listed as source number 3 on the sheet is Genesis 50:26, where it just says Joseph died at the age of 110 years. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. That's the at the end of Bereshit. So if you've been reading anything before where we are now, you would notice that the first several verses of Shemot is not really new information. So before we look at any commentaries about this phenomenon, what would be your thoughts about why, whoever you think the author or authors of the Torah are, what would be the reason for starting off this new book with information that is basically a recap? Larry?
slightly change your question or answer a different question,
great.
I would add verses 1 through 7, if in fact I were taking the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus, and the foundation story of the new people, but I wanted to connect it to a previous foundation story, which actually had its foundation in a land that these people are going to go to, I would need to write a connection. Mm-hmm. And that would be the connection I would write. And I find it interesting, and I don't know exactly how far it goes. If you start in verse 8, besides the mention of the king who knew not Joseph, that's the end. There's no reference to Jacob, to Israel. I haven't gone far enough to see when was the first time that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are mentioned in Shemot. I'm sure that they are.
Possibly at the burning bush. I mean, I know that they are at the burning bush. I haven't, I'd have to do a quick sweep through it to see if it's anything in between them. But I know at the burning bush, when God is talking to Moshe, God says, I'm the one who spoke to all these other people. So I don't know, Rabbi Schatz, if you have other info you can weigh in here. But to my knowledge, that's the first example that's jumping out in me. So yeah, what you're saying is really interesting, that if we were to start after the mention of there was a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, that the memory of Pharaoh and all the people in Egypt, and as it's recorded in the story, it's like you're starting in a new era and you wouldn't even know what had come before. So there's some need to connect it to the past. So great. Joanna?
So talking about a comparison to a foundation story, I think there's a comparison here to the very first foundation story, to chapter 1 of Bereshit. And especially when you get to that line about how they multiplied and they increased, that language is very reminiscent of, the increase that happens, as creation is happening and how everything is going to multiply and increase. So this is going to be a very foundational story of the creation of a nation. So we're starting to parallel that. And also how incredibly important names are in the creation story, right? That as things are created and as Adam is created, everything gets their name. So I see a strong parallel there. And the other thing also I think that is really significant to note is how this chapter starts here in verse 1 with Bnei Yisrael, meaning literally the children of Israel. And by verse 13, we're starting to talk in a more expansive version of Bnei Yisrael. So already here, we're starting to see that transformation of a family becoming a nation.
Great, beautiful. And what both of you have already pointed out is that part of the mission of Exodus is to tell a story of not just a clan like we've been reading about in Bereshit, but what becomes an Am, a people. So there's various really nice connections that you've pointed out in how it's set up to show that evolution of becoming a people. Beautiful. Any other, Brant?
I think this is significant in the number 70 for some reason. They make a point of pointing out the number 70. So these 70 people are clearly direct descendants from the patriarchs in a very direct way. And there's a reason why they're mentioned here. And it's not the whole big Israel, it's the small Israel. And these are special people. I don't know why they pick 70, but there's some reason they mention 70 here. And these 70 people are direct descendants from the patriarchs. And that's what's significant about this paragraph.
Interesting. So are you saying that there's maybe a desire to point out a difference between who will become the masses and these special people?
I think that as the Israelites get to be more numerous is where they start having problems with the Egyptian population. But at this point, this is a 70 very special people that are not ordinary people, and they're at a very high spiritual or whatever existence plane. And these people are not the rest of us. When we get to the rest of us, that's when we start having this problem with, existing in a land that's not our own. But as long as it was just these 70 people, this is a fairly rarefied air. And that's why they mention it.
Nice. So that's a great segue into some of the commentaries that we'll look at, because I think there are pieces of what you just mentioned that will appear in a couple of these commentaries. So is there a volunteer with the source sheet who would like to read source number 4, what Rashi says about Exodus 1:1? Do I see a Bacharach volunteer? Gary, you can go for it.
Source 4, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, why repeat this information? Rashi on Exodus. Okay. These are the names of the children of Israel. Even though the Torah has already enumerated them by name while they were living, it returned and enumerates them in telling of their death, in order to show how dear they were to God.
Great, thank you. So if you, Gary or Marlise or anyone, if you were to just summarize in your own thinking, like what Rashi is saying here, why it was important to say their names again.
Just restating, so by emphasis, that they were important to God.
Yeah,
Great.
The relationship to God. It's not just names. It's just not Joe on the street. This is a God person that is with God thinks that this person is a special person. Very nice.
And one way that we can tell God cares about someone is even after they're no longer living, they still get mentioned. And I didn't add this part in the English just to save some space, but Rashi goes on to quote a midrash talking about how, like the stars, each person is named in their being born and they're going out and they're dying, and that it shows how much God loves them. That the text calls them by name in both of those moments. So great. So far we have Rashi's reasoning that we just, for emphasis, want to have it repeated that these people are very important to God. So we need to mention them again in the book of Exodus. Excellent. So we're going to go on to hear Chizkuni. It's a short point, but interesting, I think. Is there anyone who'd like to read source 5, the Chizkuni? Larry, great. Go for it.
Since I'm a big Chizkuni fan, he says the prefix letter Vav in the word Va'ela is intended to connect what is written here to what has been written previously at the end of Bereshit.
Great. So just, it's sort of a technical point, but also a thematic one that Shemot is the first significant word in the book. That's why the name of the book is Shemot, but it's not actually the first thing that is said. It's Ve'ela, and these. So right off the bat, he's noticing that it's like you pick up volume 2 in a trilogy or something, that it's clearly showing it comes after something else, because there's this vav that automatically connects it to what came previously. So excellent. Any other thoughts or questions so far before we go to the third commentary? Joanna?
More so connected maybe to the previous than this one, but I just had the thought that the name Yad Vashem, which is a phrase from Isaiah where it talks about, having a monument and a name, and that name will be everlasting, as a way of remembering, people who have passed away. And like that, we don't just, like the Hebrew quite literally is not just a memorial, but says how important it is to remember the name.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, it's something that's embedded in so many aspects of Jewish culture that we give names to new babies for people who have passed away, to say that, like, as this person will continue living through their name. So it really, it's significant to hear names after someone has died, which is what we're doing in the book in the beginning. And a couple of people already mentioned that there's going to be like a new birth of a nation. So perhaps these names can be some of the inspiration for, like what people and qualities are getting infused in this new creative process that's going to be happening, going from, the just a handful, a group of 70 of Israelites to Am Yisrael. Great. So let's go on to hearing what Rashbam has to say about this first verse in Shemot. Would anybody like to read number 6 on the sheet, Rashbam? I saw a hand. Larry, go for it.
Sure. Ve'elat Shemot, seeing that the Torah wanted to let us know how the Israelites had increased and multiplied, it became necessary to repeat that when they had arrived in Egypt, they had numbered only 70 souls.
Great. So this Rashbam is saying the information becomes newly significant when it's repeated in a new context. So while we may have already known that was the number, we are hearing it in relation to, I think at least one person has already pointed out that, Brant, that was you, right? Talking about how that they started to have problems when it became the more than 70. So by repeating that they started at 70, it can help illustrate both how much they grew and also just kind of the past to explain how they got on that trajectory of getting into this conflict and all that jazz. So what I thought was interesting about this Rashbam, and then I'm curious to hear your thoughts about any of them again, but it just reminded me that hearing the same piece of information, in this case, it's, a fact, it's the number of people, in relation to something else, or if you know the story that becomes before or after, can have different significance. Like at the end of the book of Genesis, we might have thought, wow, there were 70 people who were all connected to Yisrael, who were in Egypt, and wow, they had like a pretty strong group going there. But then when we hear about how much they continued to multiply, looking back, it's like, oh, there weren't actually that many people, or maybe we do still think it was a lot of people. But it's just interesting how the same piece of information in a different context can take on different meanings. So for me, it was Rashbam in particular that got me thinking about what it might mean going into the secular new year. Because at least in a lot of people I'm seeing on social media and things like that, it seems like there's a strong urge for people to want the break in the year to be totally as if nothing came before and it's totally new. Obviously, when the clock struck midnight in whatever time zone you live in on January 1st, 2021, of course, all of the woes and concerns and everything that came before in 2020 are gone. And we can say 2021 is going to be a totally new, fresh experience. Whatever my problems were, they're gone. The good things can stay, but that's it. And I think that seeing some of these commentaries and from the Rashbam mindset, that you can repeat the same piece of information, but maybe it's going to mean something different. And I think that there's something to that, to say you can still start a new chapter, but you can take some piece of what came before and connect it to a story that's going to be different. So I guess I'm kind of curious to hear other reflections on any of these pieces. But yeah, so just curious to hear your thoughts in general about these commentaries and the bridge between these two books, and are we starting a new story or is it a continuation of the old story?
I'd like to comment on the secular New Year, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, please. That's where we're going next for the rest of the time.
What I'm saying is that we're being too harsh on it.
Yeah.
The reality is people in the world do not stop and reflect often enough. And if the greater world stops on New Year's to reflect a little bit about where we've been and where we might head, then the New Year serves a valid purpose. In other words, you could make the same argument about birthdays or about attending high school graduations, reunions or something like that. But every once in a while, you have to stop. You have to think at what transpired over the last year or the 10 years when you saw these people last, and what it means about going forward. In that sense, the secular New Year serves a very valid purpose for the greater society, even though it's not like a religious New Year like Rosh Hashanah. So
Mm-hmm.
I've heard twice today the kind of belittling of the secular New Year, and I just don't see it that way. So,
oh, gotcha.
Both you and Rabbi Schatz, and I keep wondering, where's that coming from?
Oh no. Thank you for that reflection. I think that helps me see like how what image I must have been presenting about it. I think my view of it isn't to belittle it. I think it is actually like, I'm appreciative that as a Jewish person, I have a chance for the Jewish New Year and the secular New Year to have those reflection points. I think the danger in it is when we fall into an illusion that it is, it's an arbitrary breaking point, which can be helpful for reflection, as you pointed out. I think where it can get used in a dangerous way is when people fall into a trap of thinking that's like I'm holding on to the illusion of control because of that arbitrary break in how we measure time, and not taking the lessons that are really connecting, like in the way that Shemot wasn't a totally new story. There had to be, we've seen all these many reasons, there had to be some points reiterated from what came before. And which doesn't mean it's tied to all of the challenges or heartbreak or any of the things that come up in the stories of Bereshit, but it means it has to remember that those happened. So I think that, like, as you're saying, Brant, it actually, like, it can be a super important time to reflect. And we actually need to, like, hold on to a piece of what came before, even if it's really hard, to inform the story that we're trying to write in the new year. Does that resonate with any of your feelings? Great. I appreciate that comment. Other thoughts? We can kind of jump into the reflecting about the secular New Year piece too. Larry?
I'm not. I'm going to go back to the text.
Beautiful.
And for this one, I wish Rick were here, Rick Muller. So the first 7 verses I'm suggesting were added on.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the trope on the first 7 verses, 4 of the verses have no etnachta. And you've got that funny list of the names of the 11 sons. And the 11 sons are divided into 4, 3, 4. And there's no, the etnachta usually divides the verse into 2. But then you've also got that interesting and strange verse about the death of Yosef. I guess it's verse 7. If I'm looking in the right place, sorry.
It's verse 6, I think.
Verse 6, right. You're right. Thank you. V'yamat Yosef v'chol achav v'chol hador hahu. And that's also doesn't have an etnachta. And I don't have any basis for saying this, but all of that suggests, and I don't know that anywhere else in the Torah, it could be, that the Masoretes put that many verses together without an etnachta. You see it all the time. It's not that rare. But to have 4 of them out of the first 7 suggests to me some sort of appendage here, that these verses were just sort of scrunched on here as a joiner.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Could be. I would have to personally do more research about the history of it with the Masoretes, but that's super interesting. I hadn't actually noticed that about the etnachtas. And I would think that would suggest that there was some kind of unified different vision for what those verses were doing.
I'll just add, even when we read the 10 Commandments, at least in Yitro, the trope that we use when we're reading it during the normally in the Torah doesn't have this divided verses. It's only when we read it with the special trope that we actually divide those short commandments into separate verses. So that would be another place where you would have a whole series of verses without an etnachta, because you've got those 2-word verses.
Mm-hmm.
And all that other,
right.
all that.
Right. Interesting. Well, more to learn about. Wait, I just saw a hand. Rebecca? And then I know Rabbi Schatz had a comment too, but Rebecca.
Oh, that's okay.
On the I was just thinking in terms of the names and naming Jacob's 12 sons, when we look back at what we read this morning at the beginning of chapter 49, where Jacob goes through each of the sons and talks about them individually, and that's as they were individuals. But then, at the end of Bereshit, they all come together and bury their father, and Yosef is the only one really who's mentioned. So they're not mentioned again as they came together. So I'm thinking perhaps in the listing of the sons together now at the beginning of Shemot, it's again showing that they came together and they're not individual with their individual attributes like they were before. They've buried their father, and the verse talks about the sons who came with Jacob, and then it just lists their names. So now they're all sort of united as a unit together.
Nice. Does that change your understanding of like what this introduction to Shemot is doing, if that unity is important?
Yeah. I mean, because it starts out with them united as this family unit.
Nice. So that can like inform how we might think about the book from there. Obviously, some conflict arises, not so much between them at that point, eventually, but very interesting. Great point. Thank you. Any other thoughts? I mean, my general reflection question, if there's no other, Rabbi Schatz, let's go to you, and then I'll have a question. Yeah.
It's okay. It's very short. I was just going to say that I'm always struck every year that the way in which we enter Shemot is a very different view into this family than we've had ever before. So similar to what Rebecca actually just said, that there is a sense of unity here that we never see except for at the kind of final moments of certain pieces of the past two parshiot. And yet the way in which the Pharaoh is understanding these people is that they were so together that they've become now populated far beyond what any Egyptian could ever imagine. And it just makes me think about families in oh, hello, Rosie. It makes me think about families in general, that we don't necessarily know what's going on the inside, but that I'm a very from dog in the house. But that we have to be on the inside to really know what the relationships are like, rather than this eagle eye view, which is what this new Pharaoh had of this family, of not necessarily understanding what the real relationship and the real strife was about.
Interesting. Right. They got read differently or misunderstood. The other thing that your comment just made me think of is that when we choose to hold on to a piece of the story, but also let go of a piece of the story, that there's the mentioning at the beginning of Shemot of those brothers without the strife that carried us through a good chunk of Bereshit.
Yeah.
And that there's something, I think, hopeful about the fact that you can name a piece of the story that you're holding on to from the past, but also allow it to have some new life and new unity. And like to say, this is the narrative about it that I'm putting forth right now about this thing that also had complicated pieces too. Mm-hmm. Which kind of leads me to my final question, if a couple of people want to weigh in, is just to say, as we're going into the new secular year, is there something that you're a piece that you're holding on to that you want to maybe in part like include but name differently, include but present differently, that there's something from the story in the past year that is important to you to hold on to in this new chapter, but also maybe it's going to take on a slightly new life in the new year. So reflections, is there something that you want to bring into the new year or want to let go of, or like something in between? Marlise?
Okay. It's not necessarily making different, but I guess I was commenting back on what you were saying about people kind of wanting to just have this year 2020 be gone. And for me, being in a place of mourning, I look back on the year as like the last year that I had some time with my mother, and be it secular or Jewish year. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to just wish that away and say, be gone with it. It's something I think, as in the verses connecting Bereshit and Shemot, and as in just our tradition, which is, memory is such a big part of that, that I take comfort in that and do want to hold on to that, and not, obviously taking it into my life now, which is very different than it was before, but it's something I want to continue and honor.
Absolutely. And, Zichrona Livracha, and may her memory and name be a blessing as we're seeing in the way that can bring us forward too in this chapter. Thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else? We maybe have time for one more reflection. All right. Well, whatever is in your mind and heart that you are holding on to a piece of, but also breathing some new life into it for this new year, I hope all of your wishes and hopes will come to fruition in their own way, and that we'll also be able to connect our stories to what has come before and not shy away from those previous chapters.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.